Today, we want to talk about surrender and its role in the spiritual and whole being development process, which is going to include some myth busting and some clarifications that we hope will help you all in your process. Let's start by considering the core issue that underlies the entire issue around surrender, and that is the perception of separateness. When we're in gestation, when we're in the womb, there's no question as to whether we're separate or not. We're not developed enough to even consider such a question. We're just living in a kind of unawakened unity. We're just not aware of what's going on very directly in that way. But after we're born, the feeling of separation from our mother can be shocking, and it can leave very deep impressions that affect us for the rest of our lives. After we're born, some of our needs are not perfectly dealt with. We don't get everything we want when we want it, as happened when we were in the womb. And sometimes we feel close to our parents, and sometimes we don't feel so close to our parents. So sometimes we feel very separate. And add to this feeling of separateness, the transmission we pick up from just about everybody on the planet, just about everybody in the world that we grew up in, believe in fundamental separateness and act that way. And so we grow up in that context, assuming that's just true. This causes us to begin recognizing at some point that the feeling of separation doesn't feel entirely right. We start getting intuitions that there's got to be something beyond this. And we find ourselves eventually recognizing some deep inner need for unity of some sort. So we start seeking that, but we can't go back to the womb. So, even if this impulse comes up when we're pretty young, we're sort of thrust into the world to find some way to seek unity. Right, maybe we try to find it by uniting with another person. Maybe we try to find it by creating unity of beliefs or actions between people, or maybe we try to find it by surrendering what feels like our separate self to God or some unifying principle or higher authority or order. And remember, we're talking about the perception of separateness. Life is already in unity. It doesn't need us to recognize that. We need to recognize that because our perception of separateness is very partial. We'll put it that way. The reality is that the universe has always been one thing, and we just are going through a process of development, of growth. And the perception of fundamental separateness is really just a symptom of a stage of growth. In other words, nothing's wrong. But we don't, when we're younger, tend to perceive that there's nothing wrong because we don't feel the way we want to feel, and we would like to feel more unified, and we don't want to feel so separate. So we pursue this feeling of unity, and it eventually takes us into a deep spiritual process. Now, throughout history, our spiritual luminaries have declared that reality is all one thing. Here's a quote from Adyashanti. In the end, spirituality is not about watching the breath. It's about waking up from the dream of separateness to the truth of unity. And here's Alan Watts. You and I are all as much continuous with the physical universe as a wave is continuous with the ocean. And we've all heard this analogy of how we as individuals are kind of like waves in the ocean of being. And it's true. Both are true. There's both waves and there's individual beings here. And it takes a while for us to mature into the perception that these are one thing. And I think it's important to get that the perception of separation is not a bad thing. It's just a symptom of specific stages of development. And the perception of separateness actually is needed to bring us to unity, because unity has absolutely no meaning without the experience of duality. So in other words, we have to see the parts of life before we can understand the whole of life. And likewise, we have to find the parts of ourselves before we can find the wholeness of ourselves. Because wholeness has no meaning without it being about the whole of all parts. So we have to go through duality to get to unity, and nothing is wrong. So as we embark on a journey toward the realization of unity and non-duality and singularity, we encounter the idea that to realize unity, we must surrender our separate small self and merge with the all that is. We hear things like, thy will, not my will, be done. And in our opinion, this may sound a little shocking, but when interpreted through the duality worldview, these are some of the most misunderstood, destructive, and life-crushing beliefs that still plague today's spiritual understandings, beliefs, and teachings, and they hinder our growth and actually prevent the realization of oneness because they reinforce the belief in separation between our human selves and the infinite ocean or the divine reality of being that we're swimming in. So now let's talk a little bit about what surrender is not about, in our opinion. It's not about giving up your uniqueness. It's not about giving up your agency. And it's not about giving up your sovereignty. These things do not create separation in themselves. That perception is just natural until it's outgrown.
Yeah, obviously we have some notes. We organized this, so reading a little bit. So what else surrender is not about is letting go of your personal ego or will in order to align with God's will, as if that were separate or better. We can often end up surrendering to the wrong thing, to our idea of what we think God is, of what we think we should be surrendering to, based on religious and spiritual ideals that we've been taught, rather than trusting the cues we get in our own body. We are not separate from life.
It's also not surrender is also not about trying to get enlightened by giving yourself over to service out of another ideal. Like if I just give myself in service, then myself will be gone and I'll be part of everything. It's also not about martyring yourself for the sake of enlightenment of humanity or any positive ideas or ideals like that.
It's not about obliterating the personal self in favor of an idealized one. So it's not obliterating ourselves and surrendering to ideas and ideals of what God or goodness or the universe is. It's about being in our bodies, going with our own instructions, our own cues, because this is what life is giving us. Life is giving us our own instructions and our own cues. It's not about being spiritual or nice or pleasing or looking spiritually correct or always being compassionate or loving according to some ideal that we've heard and want to emulate. Because that separates our mind from our body and our feelings. And it's personal. It's very personal as well as impersonal.
Right. So going with any extreme, like it's all about personal or it's all about impersonal, also misses the point of wholeness and connection. Surrender is also not about avoiding words, speech, action, or relationships because they appear to divide the indivisible reality of life. We often hear people saying, yeah, words, all they do is serve to divide us and divide things. And really, it's not necessarily true. The division is already fake anyway. It's just the perception. So trying to avoid anything that we perceived was associated with that feeling of separateness isn't going to do the trick. We also tend to think maybe we should release our attachment to personal identity, desires, and control. These are simply, but in our view, these are just symptoms of earlier stages of development. We have to live through the experience of duality to get the wisdom of unity. Surrender is also not about relinquishing our personal self in order to merge with impersonal consciousness, because again, that suggests that a personal self is an obstacle or that these things are separate or different. Yet they're distinct in a sense. They can be perceived as distinct, but that doesn't mean they're separate.
It's also not about being passive, but also about taking action that is right when that is the movement arising within us. To be surrendered enough to respond in the moment when action is what is needed and called for. And we get these cues in our body too. I mean, I know for me, I was in the passive crowd for a long time, the ultra feminine passive place. And I was actually arguing when it would come in, my message would come in that action is needed. So I wouldn't always move with that when that was my instructions. That those were the cues I was getting.
Mm-hmm.
So the question was, why are we so hypnotized by these ideas? Because we want to feel unified. We want to get to heaven. We want to attain enlightenment. So we try following the paths that others have walked in. We try to believe their beliefs. But that really just takes us away from our own truth, our own uniqueness, our own wiring for how the divine moves in us.
And our own unique path to our own development and our own development of the sense of unity. It can't really be gotten through other people's paths because then we're not unified with ourselves. So in a sense, we're really talking about shifting the focus on unity to how am I not holding myself in unity? What am I rejecting in myself? What is it that I'm arguing with in my own experience?
And usually these are ideals that we have been imprinted with through religion, through spirituality, through society.
Yeah.
So we try to be that way.
Yeah, we want to be a good person.
Yeah.
We want to show that we're deserving of going to heaven and not going to hell.
Yeah.
And the feeling of separateness makes us assume we don't know how to fix it. Someone must know. And so we go find that someone and hear what they have to say about it and try to do it their way.
And that's a process too. No blame
That's right.
or judgment about it, because that's us growing into who we are.
As we said earlier, it's like when we're young, we get these ideas that we have to go searching for unity, and it's a real thing, but the world is searching for it outside. And so we get that transmission and we have to follow it for a while until we get, it's not really working.
So what surrender is about, stopping arguing with life. I think that says it pretty totally. Letting go of the fight against, fill in the blank, just against. Saying yes to whatever has arisen. Saying yes to the moment, no matter what it is. And this can also be a no. Saying yes can also be saying yes to your no.
Right. So if someone walks up and says, will you please give me all your money? I would say no. And that would arise spontaneously, and I would internally have said yes to that no. You see, really what we're talking about is getting to a stage of life where there is eventually no more of this surrender process. The surrender process really is saying, I'm still believing I'm separate and I have to surrender to something else.
Or someone else.
Or someone else. And so that, as long as we're in that process, we're not actually living in the kind of non-dual or singular awareness that we help people come to. So really, a lot of this has to do with accepting the truth of what's going on inside, starting with how we feel. If we're arguing with how we feel, we are separating from ourselves. We are causing the disunity and perpetuating it through these patterns. We're not making anybody wrong here, just pointing out it's a perpetuation of a war with life that we were entrained into, that we grew up inside of, that this whole world is still living in.
And we're being judged by people who have gone through the same entrainment. And so they can't always honor our uniqueness or what we feel. And then we get afraid to just really be who we are because we feel so dependent on the approval of others.
So a huge piece about this whole thing, which you often hear us talk about in these sittings, is the ways that we get stuck in our head and how that's a primary obstacle. Because it's our belief in these ideas that lead us on these long detours that in which we're attempting to find unity through our mind and through our mental beliefs about what we should or shouldn't be doing, saying, or feeling. And instead, it's about dropping all of that, realizing, I mean, this is in a sense one of the deepest surrenders anybody could get to. Surrendering our attachment to our thoughts
and beliefs.
And beliefs. And why would we do such a thing? Isn't that like core to who we are? After all, we think, therefore we are. This is where Descartes really got the cart before the horse. No, we exist before we can think. Our being is far more primary than our thinking. And it's true within each and every one of us. We are not primarily thinking beings. We are primarily beings that have thinking, feeling, physical experience. We have souls, we have purpose. We're far more complex than just our thoughts. And when we base our whole life on what we're thinking, and when we see the world through our thinking all the time, that is guaranteed to continue perpetuating this feeling of separateness.
And cause more suffering.
That's right.
For ourselves and others.
So part of what surrendering is about is not going with our thoughts and beliefs. It's allowing both personal and impersonal realities to be true, not choosing one over the other. It's about really embracing the current moment truth that we're living in personally. And that's often hard to do. It can seem, if you believe a lot of these sort of spiritual ideas, like that's going in the wrong direction. After all, it is my personal small self that seems to be in the way of realizing the big self and the big truths of life. And we're here to say that is so not true.
That is the moment that we reject ourselves.
Yeah.
Over and over.
We can't realize anything until we're here in a body, for starters. Nothing's going to happen on Earth in this life until we arrive. And so we have to accept the fact that we are both personal as these human bodies, but also impersonal as the ocean of being. Both realities are true. And if we reject either side of these things, we're at a war that no one can win, and it doesn't bring unity.
My example.
Yeah.
So as an example, I was thinking what might people say? Well, I feel anger. How do I surrender to that? And you don't surrender your anger. You feel it. You feel it. You don't land in it and identify as it, as though it's you, but you feel it. And you learn to express it with skill, no longer using it as a weapon or a defense or out of reactivity. You stop fighting the fact of what you feel. And it's just energy. You let it move, you let it be. You stop believing there's something wrong with how you feel. That judgment that just gloms on and squashes who we are, makes us feel shame for feeling what we feel. So yeah, you learn to feel it, but not land in it.
Mhm.
without holding or controlling it. You just let it be there
And it's
and
true.
let go of the judgment.
The same thing is true for all the feelings, all the positive feelings, all the negative feelings. Usually we have a problem with the negative feelings. That's why we call them negative feelings. And so let's say you're feeling a sort of underlying depression, but you're afraid if you let yourself feel that, you'll drop in and it's never going to go away, which isn't true.
Well, but you may have had that experience in the past. So there is a fear about that.
And so basically, what happens when you allow yourself to register the truth of what you're really feeling and go in there and feel it and embrace it, not just like allow it, but really like, wow, this is how I actually feel. I have a right to feel this way. There's nothing wrong with feeling the way I feel. And the more I feel it, the more I am in my body. And so that's why we encourage feeling. It's not about indulging, we're encouraging feeling. Allow yourselves to feel how life is flowing through, how life is expressing yourself as you. If life gets angry as you, it's life. It's okay. Let it happen. But learn to be skillful with it. We're not just saying, spew on everybody whatever you want to say about your feelings. We're saying allow yourself to feel it, learn how to be skillful. We teach that also. And learn how to allow life to flow through you. And the more you do that, the more we get to where surrender takes us. And where surrender takes us is living in flow. Living in flow is a subjective experience that is analogous to water flowing down through a bunch of rocks in a stream. The rocks aren't a problem. Staccato is not the opposite of flow. It just flows right around them. Nothing stops it.
Chaos is not the opposite of flow.
Right. Water doesn't go, damn this rock. I am so pissed. What is going on here? Why is this in my way? No, it just follows its own nature and keeps going instead of being at war with what's going on. And we as human beings have this remarkable capacity to grow into living that as a stage, not a state, not a temporary experience. 24/7 for the rest of our lives, we can live in flow by not being at war with what is, by embracing the truth of what we're experiencing and learning to express and not hold back the truth of what we feel.
And by saying yes to what is flowing through us, no matter what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So living in flow does not mean that we say yes to everything. It means we say yes to what feels right and no to what feels wrong. These are not beliefs or ideals, and they will not appear to always conform to what established religion or spirituality says is the way.
Right. When you're true to yourself, a lot of people are going to think you're doing it wrong, and you're not being spiritual, and you're not being religious, and you're not a great example of humanity. But meanwhile, if the universe is flowing through you and saying, I got to be me, what are you going to do? You're going to be, if you go into believing that you should be the way other people want you to be, yeah, that we're screwed when we go there because everybody has their own idea of that. And there's no way to make everybody happy. And even if you did, you're never going to be following your own truth. It's all, that's a different thing. Following your own truth isn't about following other people's truth. It's about following your own truth. And that can it can make you very unpopular. It can take you into a place where I don't know who I am if I'm actually following this. I'm afraid that if I follow my truth, it's going to get me crucified. It's going to get me in trouble.
Because it has.
It has.
We've seen that in
Right?
history.
We sure have, over and over again. That didn't stop Jesus from doing his thing anyway.
From following his own instructions.
That's right. And then there's a way in which we're all sort of already crucified. We're already the infinite freedom of being little itty bitty living space. As I said in Aladdin, we're squeezed into this little body, into this very limited world. And the more we actually just accept the feeling of that, the more we are at home in ourselves.
Good ending.
Okay, I'm tying it up with a bow.